Welcome. So today we're digging into a really fascinating paper that asks a huge question. In a world that's seen, absolutely incredible progress, why does the study of society so often focus on the negative? We're going to explore a paper by John Iceland called Beyond Conflict: Recovering the Sociology of Social Progress.
All right, let's just jump right in with some pretty mind-blowing data. For almost all of human history, the average person was living right at the edge of survival. I mean, look at this. For nearly 2,000 years, global GDP per person just flatlined. But then, something absolutely wild happened. In just the last 200 years, prosperity has exploded. This isn't just some boring line on a graph. You could argue it's the single most dramatic change in the entire human story, and it happened in what's basically the blink of an eye in historical terms.
And that brings us to the real puzzle we're looking at today. The paper argues that if you go and pick up a standard sociology textbook, you're way more likely to read about conflict, inequality, and all the bad stuff than you are to read about the incredible story we just saw in that graph. The paper even calls this the sociology of gloom, which really makes you wonder, why the disconnect? Okay, to really get to the bottom of this, we need to understand the two main lenses sociologists use to look at the world. You can think of them like different pairs of glasses, and the pair you put on is going to totally change what you see. So, on one hand, you've got functionalism. This lens is always asking, how does this thing, this institution, help society work and stay stable? It's all about cohesion and order. But on the other hand, you have conflict theory. This lens asks a totally different question. Who's got the power here, and who's being pushed down? It sees society as a constant struggle. These are two just fundamentally different ways of explaining how the world works. For a big chunk of the 20th century, functionalism was pretty much the main game in town. But then came the 1960s and 70s, with all the social upheaval, and that really sparked a huge shift. Conflict theory started to rise, and, as the paper argues, it didn't just rise, it pretty much took over and became the central way of thinking in the field.
So, what's the big deal? What happens when one lens, one way of looking at things, becomes the default for a whole field of study? Well, the paper's argument is that it creates a massive blind spot. It stops us from seeing the full picture of how society really works.
And here it is, the main argument in a nutshell, right from the author. The idea is that by focusing almost entirely on power and struggle, the discipline just isn't as good at explaining all the good things that happen. In other words, if you only ever wear the conflict glasses, you risk seeing only problems, and you might completely miss what's actually driving cooperation and progress. So why did this one viewpoint become so dominant? Well, the paper points to some fascinating and maybe a little controversial data about the field itself. A study of 51 top colleges found that for every single Republican professor in sociology, there are 44 Democrats. The paper suggests that this kind of ideological environment might just make conflict-based theories feel more natural or intuitive. And this kind of imbalance, the paper argues, can be locked in by some really powerful social dynamics. You get groupthink, where nobody wants to rock the boat, so dissenting views get quieted. You get motivated reasoning, which we all do. We look for facts that confirm what we already believe. And you can even get something called preference falsification. That's basically when people just don't say what they really think because they're afraid of social pressure.
Okay, so that's the setup, but what are we actually missing because of this blind spot? What does the data on social progress really show that might be getting overlooked? Let's take a look at a few examples just from the United States.
First up, let's talk about living standards. Even when you adjust for inflation, the income for the median U.S. household, the one right in the middle, has gone up by 50% since the 1960s. That is a massive improvement in well-being for the average family.
Now let's look at racial inequality, specifically through poverty. In 1959, more than half of all African Americans lived in poverty. Just let that sink in. By 2023, that number had dropped to under 18%. Now, a gap definitely still exists, but that is a huge, life-changing decline. And we see a really similar story when we look at health. Back at the start of the 20th century, a white American could expect to live 15 years longer than a black American. That's a staggering difference. By 2015, that gap had shrunk to less than 4 years, a really clear sign of major progress. So, what about gender? Well, back in 1960, women who worked full-time were earning about 60 cents for every dollar a man made. Fast forward to 2023, and that's up to 83 cents. Now the paper is clear that a gap is still there, but it also points out that a lot of that gap disappears when you start comparing men and women who are in the exact same jobs working the same hours.
And check this out. In education, the script has completely flipped. For most of history, men were way more likely to finish college. But today, young women are actually significantly more likely to get a bachelor's degree than young men are. And that trend is true for med school and law school, too.
Okay, so it's one thing to point out a problem and show some data about a blind spot. But the paper doesn't just stop there, which is great. It also tries to lay out a path forward, a way to build a more balanced and, a more complete sociology.
The solution, according to the paper, comes down to balancing two fundamental moral instincts that all societies have to deal with. On one side, you've got this social justice instinct, which is all about protecting people who are vulnerable and fighting oppression. And on the other, you have the social order instinct, which is focused on keeping things stable and holding society together.
Social justice intuitions. That's the moral engine that really powers conflict theory. They are absolutely vital. This is what makes us spot unfairness and gives us the drive to challenge systems that are hurting people. It's the part of us that asks, hey, is this fair?
And then you've got the social order intuitions. These are really the foundation for functionalism. They're essential for building and maintaining the stable institutions, things like laws and norms and families that let a society actually function and thrive over time. This is the part of us that asks, yeah, but will this actually work?
And here is the absolute key insight. A healthy society and a healthy social science has to hold both of these in tension. The paper warns that when one of them completely takes over, you get problems. A society that's obsessed only with order can become rigid and oppressive. But a society that's obsessed only with tearing down structures for justice can accidentally destroy the very foundations that make progress possible in the first place. Which leaves us with this final, really powerful question to think about. If we really truly want to solve our biggest problems and build a better future, is it enough to just focus on what's broken? Or do we also need a deep, robust understanding of what has actually gone right and why it's worked? The paper's conclusion is pretty clear. Without both, we're kind of just flying blind.